came across a comment on Twitter the other day, and I wish I would have screenshotted it, but the gist of it, the essence of it was that Souls games are actually not good, that people that like them are masochists and they only like them because they're following some sort of train of other people that like them too. It's almost like sheep mentality. That's the only reason why Souls games are considered good. And that got me thinking that I would love to do a video where I put this to the test. Are Souls games actually good or just overinflated hype? The Souls games are not good. These games are not meant to be enjoyed. Before the toxic Souls community starts screaming the usual, "Get good, you suck, it's easy," remember the nature of this subreddit, which is unpopular opinion. They're not designed very well at all, their stories make zero sense, and the community is more toxic than anything you will ever experience. Have you ever played Overwatch, my friend?
Never play Sombra again. You're actually terrible with her.
If your friend tells you to buy anything from the series, save your money. I like this reply here. Honestly, the weird thing here is that you've beaten games you don't like multiple times. To look at something and see if it's objectively good or objectively bad, you have to look at measurable critique points, measurable accomplishments, and measurable impact. For example, I can look at a game that I absolutely hate and see how it could still objectively be a good game. That game for me is definitely Stardew Valley. My introduction to that game was I chopped the tree down for 3 minutes just to fucking pass out in my front lawn from exhaustion. And then instead of being left alone on my own property, I got charged a medical bill for being dragged inside my house and diddled that night. From the literal second that I stepped into this godforsaken valley, I was put to work. Say hi to literally everybody that lives here. Bro, I don't even know my neighbor in real life. Find me a fish. Slay this monster. Eat my dick. How about that, valley goers? Cozy games aren't really my style of game. They just don't fire on the cylinders that my brain needs in order for me to have fun. I can put my opinions and everything that I am biased towards aside and still see that Stardew Valley is objectively a good game. All of these gripes and complaints that I have are heavily led by emotion. This game is just pixelated chores. You can't say somebody is bad at basketball if they've made it all the way to the NBA. I can't say that Stardew Valley sucks if I look at the fact that it's got a massive following, its implemented mechanics work as intended, the amount of game that you get justifies the price. It had a lasting impact on survival games as a whole, making it one of the more beloved games in the genre. But we're not here to talk about Stardew Valley, okay? We're here to talk about Souls-likes, the Souls-like genre. In order to answer the question whether it's the games that are dog shit or it's just the people criticizing them, we're gonna do a deep dive to some categories here, keeping in mind the 3 criteria that I'm gonna use as measurable outcomes for whether or not something is objectively good or bad. The game's success, the mechanics that were implemented by the devs, and whether or not they work as intended. And lastly, I forgot. Impact. The game's impact on the video game community as a whole. Quick disclaimer, I personally do love Souls-likes myself, but I'm gonna try to be as objective here as possible, as unbiased, I should say, as possible when I'm declaring the facts. And I will make it very obvious when I'm saying something that's opinionated. The goal here is to infiltrate the hater mindset, all right? And really to squeeze the truth from the teat of the salty people, figuratively. I will not be touching anyone's teats. The heavy hitters in the genre are, and I think always will be, the games developed by FromSoftware. Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, Sekiro, and Bloodborne, and Elden Ring. Almost forgot Elden Ring. Damn, they have so many games. Looking into other games may be a bit redundant because there are a lot of games that fit into the Souls-like genre. The redundancy would come in because they are essentially pulling the same formula that FromSoftware has established with their games. So why not take a look at the root of the genre instead of generalizing that every Souls game is good or every Souls game is bad? Demon's Souls was the start of something very, very evil. This bridge is evil. This boss is evil. When they put an item in an empty room and you stroll up to pick it up thinking, yay, I found something, just to realize it was a trap all along and you're about to be gangbanged by whatever annoying enemy they put in there, is evil. There's a lot of speculation here about which games actually influenced the original Demon's Souls and then subsequently the Souls-like genre as a whole. One of which I think I should mention for this video because I feel like I've seen it a lot. Ico. Ico being the inspiration for the large and mysterious interconnected world, as it says here, being the touchstone for Dark Souls world design,
which is one of the biggest reasons people love these games. Shortcuts are huge, even in Elden Ring's open world design. The interconnection within the smaller areas of the map presents a uniquely difficult world traversal. Good luck trying to figure out where the fuck you need to go next.
You look at the next area that you want to go to and you're like, this path should take me to that area, you know, logically. But in reality, in these fucking games, in reality, what you have to do is you actually have to do a rain dance, which then summons a giant that picks you up and shoves you up its nose. And then you have to climb all the way around its vertebrae, slide down through its butthole, and end up on top of a rock. You have to put a coin inside of this rock that opens up an elevator, so you can go into the elevator and take it all the way down to the core of hell, and then ride a volcanic eruption all the way up to the area that you actually wanted to end up in.
That's obviously an exaggeration, but I think it's a fair assumption that Ico's large, mysterious, interconnected world was an inspiration for the world design for Souls games that we know today.
I've heard Kingsfield a lot, but I've actually never seen that game in my life, so give me 1 second to research it. Oh wow, okay. It's actually a game developed by FromSoftware, so that makes sense that it would be an inspiration to a game that they later made. I can tell you right now that this is definitely an inspiration for at least Dark Souls 1, because that skeleton alone gave me depression and high cholesterol. Going through the catacombs in Dark Souls 1 was probably one of the worst experiences I've ever had. Those traps do shit for damage, so I'm not even worried about them anymore. Ah! You can see the inspiration just based off of the character design alone. Obviously, looking a lot better in the remastered Dark Souls 1 version now, and I'll put it up a side by side in the screen. Hopefully I'll remember to do that as an editor. I've also seen a lot of comparisons to the original Onimusha, because of course the Onimusha games have the classic progress through a world, progress through a bunch of ads, get to a boss fight, or boss room I should say, beat the boss room and progress through that as you get keys and better items throughout your experience. So just based off of that description alone, of course you get your basic ingredients for your Souls likes.
Spice, and spice.
If this little graph and chart is accurate, that means Demon's Souls, which released in 2009, got a total sales number of 2,500,000. Is that how you say it? It got this many sales and this many sales in 2020 when it re-released as a remake, which is actually heftier numbers than I was expecting, only because I've always known the Souls games to be a little bit more particular, a little bit more in the niche area, up until, of course, Elden Ring, because Elden Ring kind of blew up on social media and everywhere else. For the PlayStation 3, it sold over 2 million copies. For the PlayStation 5, it sold over 2 million copies. Meanwhile, you know, the Dark Souls trilogy is doing a lot better later on. Holy shit, the spike, dude. The spike is insane. Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 subsequently did better each time. I guess a little bit less for Dark Souls 2, but still pretty insane, pretty nuts. Bloodborne hitting 7 million, Sekiro over 10 million sales copies. And that just goes to show too, because you see the limited platforms in which these ones were made for PlayStation, because they had the Sony exclusives in 2009 and 2020. 2011, they went to multi-platform, sold a ridiculous amount more. 2015, PlayStation 4. Bloodborne, by the way, is absolutely a gem of a game, and Sony needs to release its grip on this fucking game and allow for us PC nerds to get our grubby little hands on it and add a ridiculous amount of mods on it. Maybe more frames. I would like more than 30 frames. Thank you. But anyway, Sekiro, multi-platform, obviously PlayStation 4, Steam, Xbox One. You see a ridiculous amount of sales on this one. Elden Ring blew everything out of the water. The charts were discarded is a word. Shadow of the Erd Tree sold more copies than Demon's Souls ever did, and Shadow of the Erd Tree is a fucking DLC, so that should tell you something. So obviously the popularity and growth of these types of games never stagnated. They might have gone down a little bit here and there, but never stagnated, and that's because these guys make quality titles. I definitely feel like games as a whole, outside of the genre, within the genre, games as a whole have gotten easier over time. And not just because of like a difficulty setting or artificial difficulty being taken away or put into these games. It's because of quality of life. Games as a whole have become more inviting. Remember when autosaving wasn't the standard? What was the standard though? Giving 3 lives to beat the entire game, fixed camera angles, no tutorials, no hand holding of any kind. I mean, gaming was brutal at one point. I love quality of life, and I love that games have held themselves to a specific standard when it comes to quality of life, like modernized gaming. But could it be that we've overcorrected a bit? Maybe we went from no hand holding to holding hands so tight as if we were crossing the street with toddlers on a busy road. And maybe that's why these games thrive, because they provide the challenge that other games simply just don't. It's definitely not everyone's cup of tea and has always generated some sort of cult following. And that alone is why I'm surprised that Elden Ring hit mainstream media as massively as it did. And it brought a lot of people into the series that hadn't played any Souls-likes before. Let's take a look at some of the iconic mechanics that were introduced with Demon Souls.
The Souls games are notorious for being punishing games. You earn XP through a system of killing enemies, which is pretty straightforward. The harder the enemy is to kill, the more XP you get. The punishing part comes in where if you die, you drop those souls, and if you're not able to pick them back up again before dying, you lose that XP forever. Imagine dropping a metric ton of XP, but fuckboy McGee wants to sit on your face 7 times in a row, so you lose out on the chance to pick it back up. To me, this mechanic is what determines whether or not a game is a Souls-like. Not every Souls-like is made from FromSoftware, as we talked about before. There are many games within the genre that have adopted the mechanics derived from Demon Souls.
The leveling system gets a little bit more complicated. It's not as straightforward because you get into things like weapons and scaling and armor scaling, etc., etc. My first Souls game was Bloodborne, and you could not get me to understand what the fuck scaling meant to save my life. This statistic is directly linked to the weapon, whether the weapon is going to be good or whether the weapon is going to be bad. I couldn't wrap my little head around that subject for a very, very long time. It took me a long time to get used to the scaling mechanics and everything like that. But of course, the more games you play like this, the more you're used to it you get.
That's not a mechanic that's very new player friendly. Imagine not knowing anything about Souls games just for one to throw a ridiculous amount of weapons and armor at you, each with its own attributes and scaling, and telling you to figure it out. With what seems like endless build crafting and character modification, it can be a bit overwhelming and complicated. You find a weapon that slaps early game and come to find out by the end of the game you've been upgrading all the wrong stats. Now you're left fighting with a wet noodle.
So the leveling system and the weapon scaling and the armor scaling, I think, is where it's subjective whether or not you think this is a good mechanic. You're either gonna love this or you're gonna hate it. You're either gonna understand it or take the time to understand it, and every single game can be a little bit different, or you're going to absolutely hate this mechanic. Let's talk about the next mechanic that this game has introduced into the Souls-like genre, which is the interconnected worlds and the area progression.
Like I mentioned before, shortcuts are well known and expected in these games. Going through absolute hell in an area to find out there's a door that lets you skip a lot of that bullshit you just went through is extremely rewarding. It's gonna depend on your own personal likes and dislikes whether or not this resonates with you. But to me, very few other genres nail that feeling.
We're going to talk about this again later in the video, but I hate Dark Souls 1. I think it's one of the worst games that I've ever played in my life. I'm going to get a lot of shit for that. I know. Listen, we'll get into it, okay? We'll get into it. But as much as I hate that game, I think it's the most insane concept and idea that it's that old, and the entire world, I think it's insane that it's as big as it is and that it's all connected together, that everything eventually leads to one fucking world interconnected that you can get to if you decide to not die. Progression for the game has to do with progressing through boss fights generally, and that's another mechanic that was introduced in Demon Souls. The next mechanic is the multiplayer system. My personal biggest gripe with these types of games. For some reason, FromSoftware is adamant about fucking you with their multiplayer experience. This one is a subjective one as well. I want you guys to know that this is my opinion, okay, before I spew this next rant. But this is not proper multiplayer because it does not allow you to go from the beginning of the game to the end of the game with somebody else.
I should say proper co-op, not just proper multiplayer, because they do have PvP and it works relatively well. The PvP community is actually huge because these games provide a unique and challenging environment for it. Co-op specifically though is ass. All I want is a world where you can play through the game with a buddy. Both of you get the loot, both of you have your regular health bars, not the cut in half BS, both get the same amount of souls for killing enemies, and so on and so forth. It'd be cool if they even incentivized you to play with friends by providing more of a challenge with bigger rewards. Maybe that's what they're gonna do with Night Rain though. That's what they seem to be bringing to the table, but I guess only time will tell. Look at the mechanics that have been implemented not only into future Souls-likes from this dev team, but also future Souls games from fucking everyone. Everyone has to have their own version of a Souls-like, it seems. Sometimes maybe good, sometimes maybe shit. This goes hand in hand with Metroid and Castlevania creating the Metroidvania genre and creating the standard for those mechanics. Games that will forever be held up on a mantle in the gaming community because of it. Based off of impact alone, it's easy for me to say that Demon's Souls is objectively a good game.
Apparently, with these types of games, the constant fear for my life and struggle is the only thing that makes me feel alive. It's the only thing that keeps these little brain cell muscles working. But I definitely understand the perspective of not liking these games. Dark Souls has been a horrible experience.
As somebody who genuinely has a lot of love for the genre and a lot of love for these styles of games, I really thought that the first of 3 games in the series was going to bring something that I fell in love with. Unfortunately for me, it's shown me that I'm a prissy Gucci woman that only enjoys games that are modern and new. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the jank and the clonk within this game are definitely some of the reasons why I have not been enjoying it, but there's a lot more to it that I want to talk about here in the next segment where we talk about Dark Souls. Obviously, the biggest influence to this game was Demon's Souls. If you look at them side by side, you'd think this was Demon's Souls 2. Aesthetics of the world, the aesthetics of the armor, and the aesthetics of the enemies are all comparable. Same goes to Dark Souls 3. I don't know about 2 though. I never played that one.
I might still play it. I don't really know. It's one of those things that is up in the air for me. I've lost a lot of brain cells trying to play through Dark Souls 1. We already saw sales numbers for it, so I'm not going to revisit that. But I do want to say that the success of Dark Souls is probably what brought it to becoming a 3-part series. If Dark Souls had flopped, if Dark Souls was a continuation of Demon's Souls, but then the game didn't sell as well, or maybe even sold just the same as Demon's Souls, I think they would have seen it as a good roundabout way to end the series there. Now, I'm talking out of my ass here because it's literally an opinion, so let me do some research on it, actually. According to this Reddit user, it says Dark Souls 1 was supposed to be a standalone, but following the breakthrough success of DS1, FromSoftware began developing DS2 rapidly without Miyazaki. That's interesting. I did not know that. He'd already taken on Bloodborne. Oh, Bloodborne. DS2 had a very troubled development. Late in development, another director took over and kind of saved the game and brought it to an acceptable level. Blah, blah, blah. Miyazaki was on board again for DS3. It was apparent that he wasn't overly enthusiastic to make the game. Okay, so I was 100% right. According to this Reddit user, I don't know, they didn't really cite any sources, so this could also be them talking out of their ass, but
Dark Souls had so much going for it. It took so many risks with unique mechanics, multiplayer aspects, exploration, and world design that it had a lot of quirk showcasing what he poured into this game, the entire existence into designing this.
So if this was really the case, that could be a good indicator as to why Dark Souls 2 didn't do as well, wasn't as fondly received. It might still be a really good game. I don't know. I've never played it. This is interesting stuff, though. I like learning about random shit that literally doesn't make a difference in life. Dark Souls continued on with the mechanics that I already talked about, the XP, the leveling system, the weapon scaling and armor scaling, interconnected worlds, boss fights for progression, exploration, looting, and expanded upon its multiplayer systems. Dark Souls does a lot with its multiplayer systems, more than I could ever sit down and explain to you because I do not understand it myself, and I've watched several videos on it at this point that I think I'm at the point now where I've just given up.
The multiplayer system is very similar to a lot of other Souls games. You have an item, you summon a friend, they come into your world, you fight a boss, they leave.
There's more. This is like an onion. It's got a lot of layers to peel back when it comes to its multiplayer systems. You have a system or a mechanic where you're a hollow and then you're not a hollow. So you're either beef jerky or your skin is normal. It's like actual human skin. And when you're beef jerky, you can't get invaded. You can't use a lot of the multiplayer systems. But when you're a hollow, wait, sorry, I'm getting confused. But when you're human skinned or alive, I should say, when you're kindled, those mechanics become available to you. That's honestly as far as deep as I want to get into that explanation of things because there's so much more there. But I will say, as quirky as it is, as random as it feels, as complicated as the multiplayer systems in Dark Souls 1 is, I think it's an extremely unique experience. And I give it props for having that extremely unique feeling to it because it was them taking a risk, implementing a multiplayer system that is so convoluted, 90% of its player base wasn't going to understand it anyway and would play without it. It's not something that I actively was seeking to learn about. I was actually actively avoiding it. But objectively, I think it was a great system and a great risk that they took because they garnered an entire community who absolutely loves those systems and is still to this day very active in the game because of them. This game has been out since 2011. Now, mind you, the remaster probably refreshed the community a little bit and brought some people back into the multiplayer scene. Some reasons why I hate this game, other than the fact that it's old and it's jank.
The difficulty really wasn't presented with going to a boss and fighting it over and over again to learn its mechanics, trying to adapt to its moveset with different phases that it brings to the table.
And there is difficulty with that. There is that. It's just not frontline. The difficulty frontline is how do we absolutely fuck the player in every way I possibly can. There's narrow hallways with walls on the sides. So if you have any sort of weapon that swings side to side rather than up and down, those narrow hallways, if there's enemies in them, you're dead. You're hitting the wall the whole fucking time. There's also narrow walkways, no walls, right? Narrow walkways, but they put a fat fucking enemy in front of you. And I'm not body shaming the NPCs, okay? I'm talking about any enemy. Like a skeleton could be in front of me and I call it fat because it's in the way and I can't walk past it on this walkway. And of course, instinctually, I want to dodge against its swing or attack or whatever it is. As soon as I go to dodge, I roll off the fucking edge of the map. The jankiness contributes to this as well because of the fact that you have edges that look like you can touch them or you can stand on them and then you slide off and die. You have edges that look like they might be something you can jump off of and you slide off and die. There's times where you're on the smallest piece of land you could possibly think of in a 2x2 foot square New York apartment fighting a boss. You can't even lock onto the stupid boss because the camera is just fucking flying around everywhere. Every time I turn around, the camera wants to go behind me instead of actually locking onto the enemy. And of course, in this 2x2 foot space, all I can do is pray that I'm able to catch a glimpse of the enemy going to swing at me so I can dodge at the right time and get a couple of swings in before I get absolutely obliterated by the ads that are also in that room. I'm talking about the Capra Demon if you guys didn't catch on to that. You walk into a 2x2 foot room and you have two fucking dogs fast attacking you and stun locking you to death while the Capra Demon laughs and does a little dance and then smashes you into fucking pieces. I should stop yelling. It's 3 a.m. But anyway, I think I've made my point.
95% of the bosses in that game had some sort of cheeky, cheesy BS mechanic that's just absolute and utter boring, and it just looks like shit and it's not fun, except for Robin Big and the Tinder boss. Although those were difficult, they were well telegraphed and didn't rely on artificial difficulty. I'll give it credit where credit is due. Even with that hatred that I have for Dark Souls 1, I can take a step back, look at its impact, look at the mechanics, and look at it from Demon's Souls, how it grew upon that game, and look at the game's success, of course, to know that it's objectively a good game.
Even though it sucks and I hate it and it's old and it's crusty and it's dusty and it's janky. I'm honestly just salty. Does everyone hate Dark Souls 2? I don't understand why this game is so hated in the community. Can somebody explain? It doesn't live up to the standards of the other two games and has artificial difficulty with having enemies gang up on the player. I don't really understand this because the artificial difficulty that they're talking about is literally present, in my opinion, in Dark Souls 1. But we'll move on. Nothing in it was plot relevant and soul memory. What is that? Did they finish the sentence? Poorly designed areas, ganky enemies, clunky engine, easy bosses, etc. It's not bad, but it's a horrible Souls game. So there you go. I don't really have too much to add to that because like I said before, I didn't play through DS2. Maybe objectively this one's actually bad.
It is called Lothric, where the transitory lands of the Lords of Cinder converge. In venturing north, the pilgrims discover the truth of the old words. The fire fades.
Moist Critical says Dark Souls 3 is the best Souls game, uploaded 2 months ago where he did a playthrough of it. I tend to agree. Take my opinion with a grain of salt because I haven't played the second one, but from 1 to 3, it's such an astonishing difference.
What a lot of people see as clunky in these types of games isn't necessarily the case. I understand the sentiment behind that statement though. But the thing about these games that I think adds a skill cap, you're simply not going to be able to button mash. If you're button mashing without pausing to see what the enemy's about to do, whether it's going to hit you, whether it's going to dodge, it's likely you won't be able to dodge or block in time due to the fact that the button presses go into a queue and the animations don't cancel. That mechanic is the reason why people feel like these games are unresponsive. In a different action RPG, you might get to cancel the animation button and mash as much as you want without any repercussions. You can hit the attack repeatedly until the millisecond you need to roll and be fine. That's where these games add that skill cap. Having to learn the patience of preserving yourself for that press button, understanding that if you're going to be pressing it again, you have to have better time management to finish out that animation, choosing when to roll instead of attack with the added layer of stamina management. Stamina management is insanely important. And then there's also the backstab mechanic, which is one that I see implemented in a lot of these types of games. It does a big chunk of damage. There's a variation of it on Bloodborne that I think is really cool as well, which had to do with shooting the enemy at the right time, almost like a parry. But that parry allowed the enemy to be stunned or staggered, and you're able to go in for a visceral attack, which is essentially just the backstab, except you're going in from the front. It's a front stab attack. It makes some fights in Dark Souls and Demon Souls and Bloodborne, all of them, just absolutely trivial. Just run behind the enemy because it's too slow to turn with you and stab them in the ass. It's almost comical seeing someone that's never played these games before versus somebody that speedruns these games, for example. You'll see speedrunners use the backstab a ridiculous amount of times. You'll see them use the parry mechanics and make it look like, honestly, is the easiest game you've ever touched in your entire life. These dudes are just straight-faced, no sweat, no nothing, just going through, oh, he's about to attack me, parry, one-shot him, moving on, next boss. It's because of that calling the game clunky seems more like a subjective outlook. Clunky to some, cakewalk to others. Based on its success, impact, and mechanics, DS3 is objectively a good game. Bloodborne and Sekiro are the ugly stepchildren of FromSoftware games, and on their own have attracted their own little cult following that may or may not even like the other Souls games at all. That's not saying that these games are bad. They're just different iterations of the genre. There's a mechanic where you can get your health back in Bloodborne by attacking shortly after you take damage, which made this game play miles faster than the other Souls games. There was more emphasis on the weapons and less emphasis on the armor and shields in these games as well, which is cool because a lot of the metas in Dark Souls 1 through 3 are big clunky weapons with big clunky armor. It's like, yeah, you can have a shield in Bloodborne, but the only shield in the game is actually dog ass. It's actually a joke. You can't tank anything in these games. The subtle differences from this game to the Dark Souls trilogy really made it stand out and really showcases the versatility that FromSoftware has as a video game development company. Yes, you can make the argument that it's still, at its roots, the exact same formula that the other Souls-like bring to the table, but it changes so many things in just the right way that it really changes the entire feel of the game. With Bloodborne being exclusive to PlayStation, I think it's really limited the exposure that the game got, but even with that, it still became PlayStation's platinum hits, it still had a huge cult following behind it. And it's still one of the most sought after and asked for sequels for a game that I've ever seen in my entire life.
Maybe it's because I'm part of that community that really wants to see a sequel or a continuation for these styles of games, that I'm active in these forums and that I'm active in the news. But every single time I see a breaking news, Bloodborne is coming to PC, or a breaking news, Bloodborne 2 is being developed, I shed a tear because I know it's not real.
The fact that there are still people to this day making challenge runs, the servers are up, and the community continues to do PvP, PvE, there's still a very active live streaming presence that hits all of the criteria for being objectively a great game. Sekiro switched up the emphasis within the combat. It was no longer try to get out as much damage as you possibly can with build crafting and building that scales from leveling and everything like that. It was now parry and dodge as best you can, and that will reward you with a very heavy and strong attack. There's obviously more to it with the mechanics and the systems that it has implemented into the game,
but at its core, that's what it is. It's a parry simulator. And it's not just one type of parry either. You can see Fighting Cowboy here doing a little tutorial, essential guide for beginners. You can see that the parry consists of jumping and different styles of dodging within the attacks. Like you do a forward attack for a stab attack, or a jump attack for a sweep attack, or sword parry for when they're attacking you head on.
It still brings to the table things that Souls gamers really enjoy, which is the XP gain, the world progression, the leveling system. In a different way, it almost acts a little bit more like a RPG leveling system than anything else, but you get your interconnected worlds, your shortcuts, your checkpoints, your boss fights, and of course the looting throughout the world as well. What's really well done about this game in particular is the boss fights. They are absolutely epic. They have so much cinematic emphasis to them, and they really make you feel like you're about to take on the world when it comes to their boss introductions.
I don't think that Dark Souls 1 does a really good job with this, and that is arguable. That is an opinion again, but I think that Dark Souls 1 really lacks on the cinematic emphasis that a lot of the other games that I've played within the series of Souls-likes bring to the table.
The bosses are such a big emphasis within this game that there was an entire mode created specifically for boss fights. The Gauntlet mode, where you fight a series of bosses back to back, and you unlock this after beating the game. The Gauntlets are a huge part of the community and keep the player base coming back, and the Gauntlet mode really added a layer of challenge that people can come back to and do. It's not just speed runs, it's not just no-hit runs or challenge runs. Now you have the Gauntlets.
It adds a lot of layers to the charm of the game that differentiate it and set it apart from the other Souls-likes.
Brandish the Elden Ring for all of us.
I absolutely hate Elden Ring. I spent $89 on this game just to fucking die on repeat nonstop. I spent most of my, I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh. It's so hard. I spent most of my time playing it, convincing myself I like the game more than I actually enjoy the game, which is impossible considering that at any given point, there are only 3 options. You can attempt to kill everything in your path, you can strategize your way through a dungeon, landscape, etc., or you can just fucking sprint/ride turret through everything to loot. All options lead to death. I'm going to return it this week. Fuck Elden Ring. Edit. People are telling me to get good. Video game culture has developed into a... Oh, sounds like you wandered into the wrong areas where you weren't supposed to get good, I guess. What's the right area then? Every area of the game is jack shit full of cheap deaths. You fanboys are the most delusional gaming community that exists. Some of the deaths are cheap. Some of the enemy placements are going to add a layer of difficulty there that is just meant to be frustrating. I don't disagree with that. Here's my argument that stays away from being the typical get good, you suck, although it will inadvertently say that in one way or another.
If you look at people who are genuinely really good at these games, you can see it takes a long time to get to that point. The argument that this is simply too cheap would be valid if there wasn't a single person in the world that was able to be so good at these games they don't even get hit. The game is meant to introduce that level of difficulty. I don't think anybody denies that. What it's not meant to do is handhold you so that you can get from A to B place progression-wise without dying at least a couple of times. You generally need to know what an area has in store if you're gonna do a perfect no-hit run in the way that people do in the game. The nature of these games is repetition. It's understanding how the animations play out and what you need to do in order to react to them.
But how do you get to that point? With practice. Granted, other games do introduce difficulty settings. Some games go so far as to not even make it easy, but literally just make it story mode for people that don't enjoy any sort of difficulty and just want to see the story within the game. The story is arguably some of the worst shit that you can ever get in the Souls-like games, even though they're jam-packed full of lore. It's honestly a walking contradiction.
The core Souls games from FromSoftware all have hours and hours of jam-packed lore, but it's presented to you in a non-traditional way, which makes it something that not everybody's gonna enjoy. Whether or not the lore is good is gonna be very heavily opinionated. But again, looking at measurable things when it comes to objectivity on whether or not something is good, there are countless videos on YouTube, there are countless walkthroughs, there are countless pieces of media made and consumed by people trying to understand the lore, trying to get a better grip of what the fuck is going on behind the scenes in these games. And that interest is a great indicator of the impact that these games have with their lore.
One thing I think Souls-likes could do a little bit better job of is helping people understand the mechanics behind the scenes.
If I didn't have handholds from people that already love these games, that already know things about these games within the community, whether it's me streaming them live on Twitch and getting tips and tricks while I'm live, or having friends that have already played these games showing me how to get to places, what certain items do, etc. If I didn't have those handholds, I could tell you right now, I probably never would have beaten not even one Souls game. There are hidden mechanics behind the scenes within Elden Ring that are never explained to you in any sort of tutorial. There are things that the community has found through either research, trial and error, or literally looked at files for. If we're looking into specifics, just to give you a solid example, the fact that enemies have an invisible stagger mechanic that is never explained throughout any of the game is kind of nutty.
Every single enemy, from the smallest of enemies to the largest of bosses, has an invisible bar that every single time you hit them adds a chunk of stagger. If you hit them with a jump attack, for example, it does more of a chunk of stagger than if you hit them with a light attack. The more you hit them with this, the higher it builds, and it of course retracts over time if you don't hit them consecutively. But if you're able to build up enough of that stagger bar, that's when you see the enemies go into their state of like, they either get on a knee or they hunch over, or they're stuck there for a couple of seconds, free for you to take that either visceral attack, that butt stab, or you can just wail on them as much as you can within that time period that they're staggered. That is a mechanic I literally would never have found out about or known about had I not looked up tips and tricks and guides online.
Things like that are always going to be present in these styles of games, and they're never outright exposed to the community. Personally, I think that's a bad thing. I think they could be more outright about their games and how they worked, either in an optional tutorial area or just put in like a little pop-up before you start the game like, hey, these are things you should probably know so that you can have a better experience within this game. That would be something that would at least attempt to be new player friendly, that would actually give people a chance to not hate these games and give the mechanics a chance and not give up, you know, halfway through or whenever they give up. But me saying this is also a little bit of a double-edged sword, because I also believe with them not being so forthright about these types of mechanics, it adds a layer of excitement for the community to come together and share these things with each other.
It's almost like a puzzle. They don't give you the final picture of the puzzle, but they give you every single piece. And it's fun to come together as a community and put these pieces together.
The simplicity of stories being upfront is something that I enjoy a lot in single player games, but it's something that I can look past because, for one, there's a ton of people that would take the time to put together these stories in a way that's consumable on YouTube. And that has had a great impact in building a very dedicated community.
Souls-like players often get branded as masochists, and honestly, yeah, well, no, maybe. It honestly depends on the person. To me, people who enjoy Doo-Doo Valley are masochists, doing fucking farm chores all day. But me personally, I don't get the satisfaction off of the pain, off of the tedium, off of the sanity draining bullshit. I get this satisfaction when I finally learn and get good enough to be able to inflict that shit back. I got satisfaction from stomping and slobbering my balls across Radon's face after having gone through about 8 hours of him doing that to me. I really haven't found any other game that gives me the same feeling of accomplishment of having gotten through a difficult boss or a difficult area other than Souls-likes, and I think that's what keeps me coming back. That rush of dopamine is a drug, man. And while I do think a lot of points that were made throughout the Reddit post that we saw today have valid reasons not to like these styles of games, you can't objectively look at the genre and call them bad games. In other words, you hate them because you suck. So get good. See you guys in the comments. Bye.